Okay, so this is what we've been doing. So this was like the first part of the lab, was like the Terraform Docker part, remember? And what this basically was, which I know you all did, um, was we had to like automate the setup, right? Meaning that the main thing was we worked on these different CLI commands, right? Like initialize the database, seed the database, right? If that's something, right? Run some like initialization script, make sure it connects to a Postgres instance, right? And then that we can Dockerize these components, um, mainly like the backend Flask API, right? And make sure that, okay, we would probably have to change this port to, the correct port if we needed to. Make sure that this curl request works. Make sure that instead of that when you actually use Docker, that you set the host properly, right? Remember that the by default Flask will only connect to like localhost, so we needed to um, say, hey, allow like your laptop or machines outside of the environment running Flask, allow that to make requests. And then remember this whole thing with like the entry point versus command. That entry point is always being run, okay? And then basically what we're doing here is we're passing through arguments to this setup.sh file, okay? And that will call the exec function, and that exec function takes those arguments and will execute whatever's there. All right. And the reason for this is like, well, you can only have one entry point function, and we had like multiple pieces of setup that we want to occur. So instead of having like one gigantic long entry point function, we just move this to a script, right, to the setup.sh. And then remember also like, well, why not just have this in the Docker file to begin with? Well, it's because there are certain things that you want to run on runtime versus like build time. Okay, so build time is like when you build the image, and runtime is when you set up the container. So with build time, those would be things like we could say like environmental variables at that point, right? But what we can't do is probably actually like connect to the database and like set up the database, because we don't even know. We should be able to like shut down our database or do this with development and then decide to do this on production. And each time we do development, right, we want to connect it to my local database. On production, we want to connect it to my production database, right? And the other thing is like, our database is not being stored in our Docker image, right? Like, so it's like, how is this stuff even persisting? These are like operations we want to occur, whereas the image is just, you can think of that as a set of files, right? So we want to store, kind of like a Linux machine, or have the setup such that we store these, environmental files, but at runtime, we want to then perform these operations, on a running Postgres instance that really lives in AWS somewhere, okay? So that's like what we want to do on runtime, is like set up our database, run Flask, right? Like things like that. Okay, so these were these components, right? Then we build our image and we probably push it, right? You can see I pushed it. And this part, this is just a little annoying. The issue is my laptop, and probably yours too, isn't using the same chip that that AWS is using. And because of that, Docker will actually install different versions of the library. They'll do the one compatible with your chip, but not the one compatible with AWS's chip. So you can just specify this platform argument, and now it basically says, okay, I want to use the versions of the libraries that are compatible with this machine, right, with this kind of chip. All right, and then finally we push it to Docker Hub. So that was this first lesson, okay? So get it working, get everything automated as much as possible, so that you can just call like Docker run, and this backend will, right, it has to do a lot of things. It has to not only put up the Flask API, but also perform the initialization of the database, etc. And then the next lab that we worked on was, we're not even there yet. The next lab that then we worked on was the EC2 and RDS lab. Okay, and this was now, okay, let's set up the Terraform infrastructure. And to do that, right, we have to set up the database. I did a lot of that for you all. Set up the EC2 instance, right? And then probably we're going to need the EC2 instance to be able to like access the database. I mean, if it's publicly accessible, then it's fine. But you could imagine like not making it publicly accessible and just allowing the backend server to access it. And I think that's what we did. Let's take a look. Okay, so this is for my front end, right? This is our Terraform files. This is for my front end. And you can see this. This is kind of where we get to it. So here we have our EC2 instance, and we're saying that basically don't start up the EC2 instance until the Postgres database is up and running. Okay, so first wait for the Postgres database to be up and running. Then you can try to connect to Postgres, right? So we want to wait for that. And then the other thing, let's see, we have this EC2 that has a security group, right, attached to the web app, and that's here. And that basically, this gives me my standard stuff, allows, people to make requests to port 80. It also allows us to SSH, right, on port 22. If I go to the RDS, this has a security group as well. So we have this, this is where it comes in. So here we have our Postgres, and we say that this Postgres instance is attached to this right here, security group, right? And then on this security group, when we say who's allowed access to get access on 5432, it includes those with the port. It includes those entities, those resources that have a security group of this web app, of my web app security group. So it's basically like a tag, It's like saying like, hey, anybody that has, this security group associated with it, I'll let them access. I'll allow them to grant them access on port 5432. And what is like associated with this security group is our web app, right? Is this web app, it's this security group, and we attached access to it. Okay. So that, what does that do? That allows us from this EC2 instance to access my RDS instance, because the RDS instance says basically allow access, to the outside world and also to resources that have this security group. All right. Cool. Okay. So then what do we have to do left? Okay. So what we have to do is basically when you boot up your EC2 instance, a few things have to occur. Like we're going to need to pull down Docker or pull down our Docker image from Docker Hub. We're going to have to boot up that Docker image. We're going to have to make sure when we boot it up, probably that we have to make sure we have to map the ports. I don't think we have to worry about actually connecting to the database. It should do that as long as the environmental variables are set. You probably will have to set the environmental variables and like with that -e argument, and then that will occur. So how are you going to like perform these operations? Just remember that when you go to this web app, there's this user data thing, and it normally doesn't look like this. Normally the way we did it was like EOF, something like this. I forget exactly. And then we would type in, sudo docker. We'll have to install Docker, and then we'll have to start Docker, and then we'll have to boot up Docker Hub. So what am I doing here? Well, essentially, when that script gets really, really long, and yours is going to, unfortunately, it's going to get maybe like 40 lines long or something. You don't want to put that all in here. Okay, it's just going to, it's going to like cloud up, just readability standpoint. It's not very clear, right? Like we don't have to want to read up all this setup and then have to scroll to understand everything else. That should probably be moved to a separate file. The other thing is, at least for me, it's very hard to debug. As always, it's pretty hard to debug through Terraform. So what I would like to do is, remember we had we can have like an SH script, kind of the same way we did with, previously. And then we could just like have the set of commands we want to have run. and run write them out, and then SCP this into my EC2 instance, try to run it, and see it break, right, until we fix it enough times. All right, and then once we get it working, then we want it to exactly these same kind of commands to work in this user data thing. So we want to have a file that basically works from start to finish and confirm that it works. And it'll be very nice if we didn't have to copy and paste that file. So the way that we can do that is with this template thing. Okay, so you can see I have this file. It's called ec2setup.tpl. It doesn't have to be .tpl. It can be anything. But what we then do is this is a resource, data template file. And then this is the name I gave mine, which was initscript. And you can see that what's happening is it's reading from that file. So path.module is the location of Terraform. And then ec2setup.tpl is reading from this file. Okay? And a nice feature of this is that I can pass through variables. If I set this variable backend image and I put the name of my image, I can now reference this over here, all right, as a variable, essentially. So you can see this if I, let's do Terraform console. And you can see what's going on. If I do data.templateFile.initScript, you can start to see what's happening. Oh no, so here's not actually rendered. It says sudo docker pull backend image. Let's do dot rendered. I think that will work. Okay, so now you can see that it's working. So when I didn't do rendered, it's not actually, maybe it did it anyway. But either way, you can see that now it's taking that variable and it's placing it in here. Okay, so it's basically, this is just a string, essentially. So what we did was I declared, let's just show this again. We declared this template file. We declared this as variables. In the template file, I then have, reference this variable. And by doing, the official way you're supposed to do it is this data template file initScript.rendered, and that should basically compile, right? It's like using Jinja or anything else. Compile and have the variables. So this is pretty nice. What's super nice about this is things that you'll probably have to do is not just do something like the backend image, but let's say connect to my RDS instance. If you think about connecting to the RDS instance, you're gonna have to specify the host, right? What is the IP address, where the RDS host lives, and how the hell are you gonna write that out? It's impossible. So what you have to do is probably do something like get your RDS and say something like RDS host equals, and say it equals, this guy, AWS DB instance dot PostgresDB dot, whatever it's called, public host, or I forget, public domain name, right? And that will spit out the public domain name for you, right? Like the host address. And then you can set that here. And then over here, you can be like, and when you do sudo docker run, I want the environmental variable setting the host to equal what? Like probably this guy right here, right? So you can now start to think about why this order of operations is important. First, we're going to boot up Postgres, and we specify that because we have this AWS DB instance, PostgresDB. This depends on that, so it's going to wait for your EC2 machine to boot up your EC2. Won't do it until Postgres starts running. Then it's going to run what's in user data, right? And what's in user data is these various variables. Where here we're going to pull out the DNS of Postgres, right, the host address, and pass that through and perform the setup. And when we perform the setup, we're just going to download Docker or download Postgres. We'll probably have to download Docker, start up Docker, pull down the image, right? And then when we boot up that image, specify the database host address as well. Okay. So that's kind of like the last feature, which is like templates. Uh, I think it's just easier to use than, like, I think it's a lot more readable. So that's why, when I first started doing this lab, I was just writing everything in user data, and you can do that, but don't, right? Because it's just going to be harder. And then the other thing that's nice about templates is, right, you can always just take these variables, except for, I guess, this one, but basically every other variable, and just like put it up top here. And now I can run this against my EC. I can always try this out outside of Terraform, right? I can run this SCP this into my EC2 instance, try running this, or I can just copy and paste this code, and SSH in and copy and paste this code and try it. And then when this thing all looks nice and ready, it's in my template file, and I just have it run. I just say, okay, run what's rendered in the template file. Okay, so this is like basically the last step. Okay. All right. It's a good amount of work, but we can have